Hello everybody, this is Ian here, and welcome to part 3 of my ranking of the missing Doctor Who serials from those I want recovered the most to those I want recovered the least. Today we're taking a look at the third batch of stories, numbers 15 to 11, crossing the halfway point of this list. Again, this ranking is not necessarily based in order of how much I like them, but that is definitely a factor, because a person is more likely to care if a story they like is recovered versus a story they do not like. Also remember that these are just my opinions, and I'm not trying to express them as fact, so if you disagree with me, then put your thoughts in the comments below. Anyway, starting off today's list, we have number 15, The Crusade. I like The Crusade. It's a solid, enjoyable serial with great acting from all parties and brilliant direction from Douglas Camfield. The plot is intriguing and the production values are superb. There is nothing objectively wrong with The Crusade. Its placement here is almost entirely down to personal preference. Yes, the story is missing episodes 2 and 4, but we have a full set of telesnaps for both of those episodes, and episodes 1 and 3 both exist, even if the print for episode 1 is somewhat damaged and on a suppressed field print. This means that we have half of the serial. And this makes episode 2, at least, fairly easy to visualize. I have a bit of trouble with episode 4 in places, but the serial as a whole, I believe I can effectively visualize through what exists. Also, if The Crusade were found, it would complete season 2, giving us a fully extent season of 60s Doctor Who. But that's a somewhat minor benefit, though. So, as a whole, The Crusade is 15th because it's a good, solid story, but I can, for the most part, effectively visualize it, and I just prefer other stories. Number 14, The Invasion. Here's one that a lot of people probably would have put lower on their lists, but I've thought about it and I just can't put The Invasion any lower than this, which may seem odd given that it's an 8-part story missing only 2 episodes at almost the halfway point of this list. I love The Invasion, though. It's probably my favorite Troughton story and in my top 5 classic serials, and it breaks my heart every time I watch it that we're missing a quarter of it. Yes, I know we have an animation of it, but other than the fact that I'm not a huge fan of the animation, I just don't think the story works as an animation that well, period, or at least not to the same degree that, say, the Ice Warriors or the Moon Base works as an animation. The thing about The Invasion compared to those stories is that the entire thing is just on a much greater scale. The Ice Warriors and the Moon Base are both set in easily definable locations with easily definable characters. They remain fairly consistent in presentation and tone throughout, and they're both set in the future, and all of which helps animators to create an accurate visual representation of them. With The Invasion, though, it's different. The entire thing is on a much greater scale, as I said, with many more characters, many more subplots, and many, many more set pieces, all moving around at the same time, and every episode has a somewhat unique feel to it. Add to this that neither missing episode has telesnaps, and you've got 2 episodes that are almost impossible to visualize, which in turn makes them extremely hard to animate. There's a lot that's lost in these 2 episodes being missing, and there are a lot of scenes that I would love to see recovered, such as the rooftop helicopter escape from episode 4, where Fraser Hines actually hangs from a helicopter rope ladder as the helicopter is flying away like some kind of James Bond character. Then there's a scene where the Doctor and Jamie canoe down a river to one of my favorite musical cues in the show's history, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking this is the only time in the show's history the Doctor has ever been in a canoe, discounting the gondola from Shada. Then there's the scene from episode 1 where Tobias Vaughn gives Jamie a mini radio, which annoys the second Doctor to no end.
Yes, that's how you turn it off, Jamie.
And speaking of Tobias Vaughn, he is played beautifully, magnificently by Kevin Stoney, and I'd say he's probably my favorite villain of all time from everything, not just Doctor Who. It's such a tragedy that these 2 episodes are missing, and as I said, every time I watch The Invasion, I'm sad it's incomplete, but it's also missing only 2 of 8 episodes, and that's what stops it from getting higher. Like The Web of Fear, it's an excellent story, but there are just too many other stories that are missing more. Nevertheless, The Invasion episodes 1 and 4 will always remain to me as 2 of the great lost treasures of classic Doctor Who, and a recovery of them would make me happy to no end. Number 13. The Daleks' Master Plan. More than any other missing serial, I'd say that this one was the hardest to place on this list for a variety of reasons. First, and most obvious, it's the longest story in Doctor Who history, unless you count The Trial of a Time Lord as one serial, which I don't. It's the longest serial in Doctor Who history, and it's missing 9 entire episodes, 3/4 of it, meaning that it is missing more episodes than any other story in the show's history, and add to this the fact that it has no telesnaps and only the briefest clips from episodes 1, 3, and 4, and you've got one of the worst represented stories in the show's history. Nevertheless, we do have 3 episodes, episodes 2, 5, and 10, and while 5 and 10 are probably 2 of the weakest episodes in the serial, they and episode 2 do give us a fairly good idea of what a lot of the serial looked like, even if large parts of it are still unknown. This makes it easier to visualize than most missing serials with no telesnaps, if still not easy. If one thing really brings the serial down, in my opinion, though, is that it's a large percent of the story is just filler. You've got episode 1, which is a fairly generic part 1, setting up characters and setting. Then you've got episode 2, which includes the inciting incident and includes the plot being set into motion, and it is definitely one of the strongest episodes of the story. Then you can basically skip episodes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, and be in basically the same exact place in episode 11 as you are in episode 2, plus or minus a few characters. That's not to say that episodes 3 through 10 aren't enjoyable. Many of them are. The ones that come specifically to mind are episodes 4 and 6, which are both very exciting, even if they don't really do much to advance the plot outside of the Daleks chase the Doctor around time and space to retrieve the Terranium core plot. And I'm also not strictly against including them. I'm glad they did it. It's an example of how length has both pros and cons. For one, the story has a much more epic feel because of its length, but also, its length makes it kind of boring in places. I just really wish they'd found a way to make the story more compact, or a way to tie in some of these things closer to the main plot. For example, episode 3 especially could be completely cut out. Just make the episode 2 cliffhanger one of the Daleks' allies holding Katarina hostage in the airlock rather than the criminal person from Desperus, or whatever that criminal planet was called, and it would make everything so much better. For one thing, it would tie in more to the overall plot and make the villain's demands to return to Kemble more sensible and more dangerous, because this person's just going to deliver them right into the hands of the Daleks. And, additionally, if Katarina, like in the real version of events, pulled the airlock and got sucked out with the person holding her hostage, if that person holding her hostage was an ally of the Daleks, and it had to have been done to even escape the planet in the first place with the Terranium core, it would give the Doctor much more incentive to keep the Terranium out of the Daleks' hands, because he had to sacrifice Katarina to get it from them in the first place. And I think this would also increase emotional stakes even further than they already are. But again, that's just my opinion, because I think that the Devil's Planet, like the Feast of Stephen and Volcano, don't really have enough narrative reason to exist in the current Daleks master plan. But anyway, I've gone a bit long on this one already. Basically, the Daleks master plan is in 13th place because it is a really fascinating and historically significant serial which has no telesnaps and is missing 3/4 of its episodes. However, like the Celestial Toymaker, entire episodes of its story can be completely cut out with basically no change to the overall plot. And honestly, I'm just not a huge fan of it, to be honest, just as a whole, especially compared to many of the other stories yet to come on this list. Daleks Master Plan just isn't one of my favorites. So, overall, I think the middle is a very good place for it. It's not a story I particularly care for, but I also think it's an extremely important serial in the show's history, and its highly visual story and lack of telesnaps make it hard to visualize and properly enjoy in its current form, and that I do think the story needs to be recovered, but then I think every episode should be recovered. Number 12. The Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve. I would say, and I don't think that many would disagree with me in this, that The Massacre is the most lost serial in Doctor Who history. There are no surviving episodes, no telesnaps, no clips, nothing. Just some production photos and a soundtrack. And that's why it gets so high on this list, just because of how little of it still exists. I'd also say that of all those stories with no telesnaps that are missing, this one definitely suffers the most for their absence, being a very complicated story with doppelgangers and political intrigue and assassination attempts and sword fights. Basically everything that doesn't work as a reconstruction. I guess it might work alright as an animation, but even that would be sorely lacking. I'd say that The Massacre is even more missing than Mission to the Unknown, because at least Mission gets its set reused for the Daleks master plan. And this is really sad, because The Massacre is such a historically significant story. It's the first Dr. Light story. It's the only serial of the 60s to feature only one companion for the entirety of the main story. It's the first case of a doppelganger character in Doctor Who, discounting Robo-Doctor from the chase, who didn't look anything like William Hartnell. It's the first serial to feature Dodo Chaplet as a character, and that's not to mention just the heartbreaking speech given by William Hartnell at the end of episode 4. Honestly, if this list were top 26 individual episodes I want returned, The Bell of Doom would be up in the top 5 for that scene alone. Another aspect of the Massacre that makes me want it recovered is the fact that Steven has to basically carry this entire serial because, again, it's a Dr. Light story. The Doctor is absent for episodes 2, 3, and a large portion of episode 1. William Hartnell's playing the villain instead. So Steven's the only, main TARDIS protagonist for a large portion of the story, and this makes it probably Steven's best story. And as a character, that's sad because Steven is one of the most underrepresented and underrated companions in the show's history. In fact, the only thing keeping this serial out of the top 10 is that, like the Daleks master plan, I'm just not a huge fan of it as a whole. Yes, it has its moments like the episode 4 speech, but I just remember not enjoying it that much when I was watching it. Now, I will admit that this is probably because of just how little we have, and that the Loose Cannon team basically had to create the story from scratch for the recon, and that those factors definitely stop it from being enjoyed properly. Who knows, maybe this story could be an utter classic if it were recovered, but I personally doubt it. I think it will be reappraised, yes, and it will go higher in my overall ranking of classic serials, yes, but I don't think it will become a classic. I do think it would be a good story, but just for a show as consistently good as Doctor Who, being a good story doesn't really say much. And at the end of the day, I just can't put a story I don't particularly care for, but that might be good, over stories that I do love, and I love, and that I know will be good. So, in summary, The Massacre is 12th because it is more lost than any other produced Doctor Who serial, and suffers greatly from being missing, but I don't particularly like it, so it can't get any higher than it is, but it at least made it into the top half of this list. Number 11. The Savages. By this point, we've passed the line from episodes I desperately want recovered and entered an entirely new region that doesn't have words to express how excited I'd be. Now, the thing about The Savages is that no one remembers it. In the Doctor Who magazine's top 200 episodes ranking thing they did back in 2008, of every story listed in the show's entire history, The Savages received the least ratings. And that includes stories like Four to Doomsday and The Awakening that no one even remembers exist. Less than 41% of people who voted bothered to rate The Savages good or bad. It doesn't do the story any favors also that it's directly in the middle of the Lost period, being the second to last story of season 3, and that it's also wedged between two of the only completely existing stories from that period, The Gunfighters and The War Machines. Additionally, other than being the only missing serial of season 3 to have telesnaps and for being the last story of Steven, who, let's face it, isn't particularly well remembered as a companion, there is very little historical significance in this story. And all of this comes together to make a story that people tend to forget. I'd go as far as to say that this is probably the most forgotten missing serial, which is a real shame because there's a lot of great stuff here. First off, the music.
Sharp as a knife. You're right, Dodo. There is someone up there.
Well, what do we do now?
Back to the TARDIS, quick.
We're getting nearer.
The music in the serial, the one thing which translates perfectly from visual to audio, is just superb. One of my favorite scores in the show's history, which is saying something. Peter Purves and Jackie Lane both turned in one of their best performances as Steven and Dodo, respectively, and in the case of Dodo, I'd go as far as to say that this is her best performance. And that's one of the reasons why this story's missing is so heartbreaking, because neither Steven nor Dodo are particularly well remembered by the fandom, or I guess Dodo is remembered by the fandom, but she's remembered as being one of the worst companions this show ever made. And while I don't necessarily disagree with this, I do think her reputation would be significantly helped and be a bit more positive if this story existed. And with Steven, who is one of my favorite companions, I also believe it would help him to become more than just a footnote in companion history, given that he's missing a greater percentage of his stories than any other companion besides Ben, Polly, Katarina, and Sarah Kingdom, and those last two are only lower than him because they showed up in only 2 and 1 story respectively. I believe that the Savages would do wonders for both of their reputations. Admittedly, the story isn't Hartnell's best, but that's more down to the Doctor being in a semi-catatonic state for a large portion of the runtime than anything that Hartnell does wrong. And Hartnell also has good performances in other existing stories, like the War Machines and the Aztecs, which Steven and Dodo don't have as much. And what he does have is good. Look, for example, at one of the brief clips we have of this story from episode 4, a portion of Steven's goodbye scene, and honestly, it's one of the most emotional departures I've seen for a companion. Oh, that handshake. Otherwise, though, the guest performances I'd say are all solid. There aren't really any that stand out as particularly amazing, with the possible exception of Jano, but it's also really hard to evaluate someone's performance based on audio alone, and I'll go into a lot more detail on that when I talk about the evil of the Daleks. Speaking of things that don't translate well onto audio, though, cinematography. And I can tell you that this story had excellent cinematography from the telesnaps alone. Just look at some of these. The framing and angles and depth of these shots are just breathtaking, and these are only a handful of random frames of footage that happen to be captured by Jean Cura's camera. I'm not surprised, though, because The Savages was directed by the esteemed Christopher Barry, the same man behind such classics as The Power of the Daleks, The Demons, and The Brain of Morbius. One of my most coveted missing scenes also comes from this story, and a lot of that is just because of how good Christopher Barry's direction is. And that is the cliffhanger at the end of episode 1, where a shadowy, zombie-like figure lurches towards Dodo down a long, dark corridor to freaky string music. Add to this an intriguing story and seemingly high production values. I can't really say if they actually were high because, again, we don't have the footage. And I believe that The Savages, if it were to be recovered, would be considered a classic. Not a legendary classic on the level of Caves of Androzani or The Power of the Daleks, but still a classic. And I haven't even mentioned that this serial has none of its 4 episodes surviving, making it impossible to visualize. So, in summary, The Savages is 11th because it is an excellent story. It's the departure story of one of my favorite companions. It is completely missing from the archives and so impossible to visualize, and it would reinstate great performances from 2 of the most underrated companions who are frequently passed over as being somewhat poor, or at least unremarkable. That's it for this episode. Join me next time where we take a look at the first half of my top 10, and we got some great ones coming up. See you then, and thanks for watching.